For as long as humans have walked the earth, they have gazed up at the stars and longed to explore the depths of space. Countless hours of research and tremendous amounts of money have been spent on this lofty endeavour, with powerful nations attempting to be known forever as the first group of people to breach the atmosphere and go where no one had been before. The practice and investigation of spaceflight began early in the 20th century, following theoretical and practical breakthroughs by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, Robert H. Goddard, and Hermann Oberth. The first successful large-scale rocket programs were initiated in the 1920s by Germans Fritz von Opel and Max Valier, and eventually in what became Nazi Germany by Werner von Braun. With the fall of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany in 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in competition to be the first nation to go into space. In 1957, the Soviet Union achieved the distinction of launching the first artificial man-made satellite with the successful launch of Sputnik 1. The launch of Sputnik 1 shocked many Americans, who had assumed that their country was technologically ahead of the Soviet Union and led to the space race between the two countries. Despite this achievement, both nations were desperate to have one of their citizens become the first human to traverse space. At 9:07 a.m. Moscow time on April 12, 1961, a cosmonaut by the name of Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth aboard the vessel Vostok 1 for a duration of 1 hour and 29 minutes, achieving a maximum altitude of 187 miles or 301 kilometers. His spaceflight brought him immediate worldwide fame. He was awarded the Order of Lenin and given the titles of Hero of the Soviet Union and Pilot Cosmonaut of the Soviet Union. Monuments were raised to him, and streets were renamed in his honour across the Soviet Union. Yuri was publicised by the Soviet Union as the first cosmonaut, and made history by becoming the first man in space. However, according to two Italian brothers who claimed they began monitoring Soviet space program transmissions in 1957, there were others that went before him, but didn't make it back alive. These rumoured poor souls have become known as the Lost Cosmonauts. The Soviet space program, like the US space program, has not been without its disasters. Unsurprisingly, launching people to space less than a century after seconds-long flights on Earth were considered revolutionary was incredibly difficult and not without its risks. In 1960, a rocket launch in the Soviet Union killed around 160 people near the launch pad. In 1961, just before Gagarin's spaceflight, a Soviet cosmonaut was killed when a devastating fire erupted inside an oxygen-rich training capsule. In 1967, another cosmonaut was killed when the parachute on his space capsule failed to open. Gagarin himself would die a year later while training in a fighter jet, adding another name to the long list of fatalities associated with the Soviet space program. The Soviets gained a reputation, not completely undeserved, of covering up incidents that embarrassed them and taking unnecessary risks. But there have long been allegations that these publicly known fatalities are only a small part of the total number of people who died. In fact, some have argued that a number of cosmonauts were lost in space, and their untimely deaths were never reported. In 1960, science fiction author Robert Heinlein reported that while travelling in the USSR, he met Red Army cadets who told him that there had recently been a manned space launch. This launch capsule, the Korabl Sputnik 1, experienced a mechanical failure when the guidance system steered it in the wrong direction. This made retrieval of the capsule impossible, and the vessel was stranded in orbit around the Earth. The Soviets officially claimed the launch was an unmanned test flight, but according to Heinlein, there may have been a cosmonaut inside. To lend some evidence to Heinlein's theory, two Italian amateur radio operators allegedly picked up a number of radio transmissions that they claimed were from doomed Soviet space launches. Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia, a pair of brothers from Turin, claimed that they began monitoring Soviet space program transmissions in 1957, and that these transmissions proved Yuri Gagarin wasn't actually the first man in space. In November of 1960, the brothers claimed to pick up an SOS transmission in Morse code coming from a Soviet spacecraft. Based on the transmissions, they determined that the craft was moving away from Earth instead of orbiting it, which meant that the Soviets had accidentally launched their cosmonauts deep into space. The brothers eventually made 9 such recordings they claimed were emergency transmissions from Soviet cosmonauts being launched away from Earth. It was going very, very fast, Giovanni said in a later interview, and therefore it was moving away from the Earth at escape speed, and so it made us think that rather than bringing the vehicle back to Earth, it was moving away from Earth into space. In one of the recordings, a woman's voice can be heard saying in Russian that she can see flames, and asking mission control if her ship is about to explode. An excerpt from this haunting recording will be played now. If the recordings are real, then it means that the first woman in space was actually launched by the Soviets and apparently died there. And if you believe other rumours, then Soviet cosmonauts were also technically the first on the moon, after a group of cosmonauts volunteered to be launched directly into it in the Soviet lunar probe. The brothers claim that they did not speak Russian and had to get translators, as well as ask their sister to learn Russian to find out what they had recorded. The brothers maintain to this day that the recordings are genuine. The Soviets denied all of these allegations, and while they were always eager to cover up any embarrassing incidents, there are a few good reasons to believe them in this case. For instance, the lunar probes had no room to fit the cosmonauts, who supposedly asked to be fired into the moon's surface. The Korabl Sputnik 1 had no re-entry shield, which suggests that there were never any plans for the capsule to survive the trip. The Judica Cordiglia recordings are widely dismissed as forgeries these days. In his biography, Yuri Gagarin suggested that most of the lost cosmonaut theories could be explained by accidents that happened in low orbit, not actually in space. Other evidence cited to support lost cosmonaut theories are generally regarded as inconclusive, and several cases have been confirmed as hoaxes. In the 1980s, American journalist James Oberg researched space-related disasters in the Soviet Union, but found no evidence of these lost cosmonauts. Since the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, much previously restricted information has been made available, including information on Valentin Bondarenko, a would-be cosmonaut, whose death during training on Earth was covered up by the Soviet government. Even with the availability of published Soviet archival material and memoirs of Russian space pioneers, no evidence has emerged to support the lost cosmonaut theories to this day. While the evidence to the contrary is considerable, there are a few things that still do not feel right. Firstly, for such a dangerous and complicated pursuit as spaceflight, it's highly unlikely that the first manned launch into space would be achieved flawlessly. Gagarin's orbit took place a mere 4 years after the first successful launch of a man-made satellite, and the added complications of manned flight would surely take a considerable amount of time to get right. Is it likely that the Soviet Union achieved this feat at the first time of asking? The haunting recording made by the Italian brothers also seems too real to be faked, and it's difficult to believe that this pair of brothers would have the resources and time to learn Russian in an attempt to create a hoax. The question remains as to why they would do such a thing, due to the effort involved and the minimal benefit of doing so. As members of the public, they surely would not have had the technological resources to create such a convincing forgery. Numerous successful space flights have taken and continue to take place, so it seems as though this theory has been lost to time. However, there remains a possibility that Yuri Gagarin was not the first man in space, however small. While there are many claims to the contrary, these opposing views and pieces of evidence have not fully debunked this theory, and it's likely that there will always be uncertainty around the truth. It's disturbing to reflect upon the ramifications of this if true, and to wonder what it would have felt like for the rumoured lost cosmonauts to drift away from their home, as the pale blue dot becomes smaller and disappears from view, all in the knowledge that your sacrifice will never be known about by your species, as you are lost forever in the annals of time.